Greetings, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today I'll be doing a video about debunking missionaries, and this will be part one. So the main reason that I'm doing this video is because over the time that I've either lived in America or lived in Israel, I've run into a number of situations where I've had to deal with missionaries or missionary claims. The idea being the people trying to convince other people to convert to the missionary religions. And because of that, I've decided to kind of do my own version of a video based on just some of the experiences I've had and how I've dealt with people who bring missionary information to me to try to convince, specifically Jews to convert to different forms of Christianity. So this main video will be the starting off video to kind of deal with the issue of what's the truth about dealing with missionaries and what's my perspective on it. Now, the interest I have in this topic is something that I've noticed when I've seen debates between people who go against missionaries, in terms of like most of the debate being about theological issues, where I'm going to present kind of a four-part or five-part actually, way I believe that the issue should be addressed. And you see those points right here. That basically, I think the main crux I'm going to do in this part one video is dealing with the first couple of points about historical information. Often I've noticed that when the issue comes down to debating with missionaries, the issue comes down to whether or not someone can prove supposedly a theological point and make it sound good to a crowd or not. Now, the reason I find that theological debate to be useless is because in theology you can easily get into an issue of something that is not equal, trying to equate them as the same thing when in reality they're not. And this I specifically see when it comes to the Torah and the Bible that is used by most missionaries. When it comes to dealing with missionaries, strictly the ones I've dealt with have dealt with only historical facts. If you can't prove it historically, then you can't even delve into the theology of something because of the fact that if your facts are wrong, your theology is also going to be wrong along with. Of course, the reason for this is very simple because you can establish things based on facts, but in terms of theology, that's just kind of a Western word that can mean anything anybody wants it to be. But when you can establish things on basic facts, you don't have to concern yourself with what somebody believes. You only deal with what is known in reality. So I find that one of the key points when dealing with missionaries is you have to stick to historical events, historical information. So what do I mean by this? For example, ask yourself the following questions. If you're dealing with a missionary who's trying to convince you that if you're Jewish, for example, that you need to become a Christian and believe in Jesus, ask yourself the following questions. Now, it's important that these questions are not ones that you just kind of throw out there for debate, but you throw out there asking them to give you an official and historical answer on each one of them. Um, this, in a sense, can be done in preparation for if you ever have to deal with missionaries, but also if you're in the midst of dealing with someone who's a missionary who's trying to convince you, go through and basically have them deal with these seven questions that are listed here. Each of them are valid. They're not attacks, and they're also not mean, and also they're not illogical. You're basically presenting things that you would need to know before you could ever enter into a theological discussion about something because like I mentioned before, if the history is wrong or if they don't even know the history behind what they're talking about, who's to say that their theology is correct? And what is theology to begin with? And that's going to bring us to an important timeline issue. So let's delve into what I even mean by this. When you look at a historical timeline of the missionary perspective on their religion, their reality, or their belief actually, what you find is that from about the first to second century, so that's the time that the New Testament, as a text, tells us supposedly that the Jewish Christians existed. We know that basically they disappeared within a certain period after that. Their texts that they had all, basically are questionable, disappeared, or non-existent. And the only information that's left about them comes from people who were not even at the locations mentioned in the New Testament initially, as well as people who didn't know Jesus, didn't know his disciples, if any of these groups of people even existed. So basically, the people who were not there had nothing to do with the historical content that's mentioned in the New Testament, or the ones who or the writers or the ones who supposedly are the maintainers of the text, and that presents a very highly questionable situation, especially when you deal with in modern times. If you look at the later part of the timeline, that all modern day Jewish, Jesus believers organizations such as Messianics, such as Jews for Jesus, and even the group who calls themselves the Nazarene kind of format, none of them have a continuous, unbroken chain of connection to the early Jewish Christians who existed more than 2,000 years ago. All of these groups started at the most with Jewish Christians, for example, in the late 1800s, or modern iterations that have no connection to that historical background, which presents a theological problem. The last group that we can actually identify as being the Jewish group of Christians, potentially, comes from descriptions in the Church Fathers' writings. The Church Fathers being the non-Jewish group who started somewhere after the third or fourth century, and who were basically writing about the various heretics that existed previous to their time, or even maybe in their time. And they mention several groups as being those heretics. Now, again, this brings up some questions that, like the previous questions, you should consider of bringing them to a missionary when they try to throw these things at you, knowing the historical content that you do. And these are some questions that you should approach them with. Now, of course, someone may ask, what are the relevance of these questions? Why are they even important when dealing with the issues of the theology that they want to get into? And there's several reasons for this. First of all, if the main person who supposedly knew everything about the theology that they're preaching didn't write anything himself, and if none of his followers wrote anything that can be identified in modern history themselves, that's a huge problem. There's no reason for me to believe something if I don't have the original source material. Let me give an example of how important this question is. If you look at the history that is given based on the New Testament, for example, they tell you that in Acts 2 that something happened historically, but then there's no like eyewitness accounts to it found anywhere else except for that text itself. All the Jews that they are claiming to have seen this event that took place in Jerusalem, there's nobody outside of the Book of Acts that ever writes about it, talks about it, anything to that degree. I mean, it's quite obvious that the author of this text is trying to make a symbolization or to try to make a connection to the Torah and Shavuot when all Jews received the Torah. But obviously, there are a lot of Jews around the world who have the same account of that event and have the same history about it. But you don't find any Jews who mark any of the events mentioned in the New Testament as having to have happened to their ancestors historically. Now, one of the reasons I call out this particular event mentioned in Acts 2:8 is because of the fact that it actually talks as if lots of Jews from around the world were there, but yet there are no Jews from anywhere in the world that have this story as something that their ancestors ever saw or knew. Just to put this in short, I mean, basically, this particular section of Acts talks about Jews from being around different places, coming to Jerusalem and seeing this event happening to the various followers of Jesus, for example. But then there's nobody who can account for this. The Book of Acts is like the only source of information for this event, and no Jew, says that their ancestors ever saw such a thing. This same historical roadblock, as I will call it, exists also in the Gospels too, which describe supposedly the life and times of Jesus and his followers. That the actual texts themselves are anonymous; they don't mention who their authors are. And further to that, the early church fathers are the ones who added the titles to the text. And there's no Jews who were ever involved saying that, okay, these texts were written by this person, who is the father of this person, and these texts were passed down to this group of Jews here, and there's no Jews that you can identify in modern times who can be connected to any of these texts. So that means that basically the people who can identify these texts as, in any way in terms of information and what they're supposed to mean, is nobody who can be found within the Jewish community. So a Jew would have to reject that. Now the other aspect of this is that there are also some non-canonical gospels that give a different interpretation of Jesus or different information about him that is different than the ones that are the gospels accepted by most missionaries. So most of the time when I've brought this up to missionaries, they don't want to ever talk about these texts. They try to come up with some reason why these texts are unacceptable, but none of those reasons are based upon anything historical, anything that can be connected to a group of people who are going back to the first group of Christians that are part of that broken timeline. So this is something that I find to be a very important starting off point dealing with the history. In part two and part three, I'm going to be dealing with some other aspects that basically make this an issue that you can ignore to some degree.